So I have a radiator repair to try today. This was almost a disaster. I have a little bit of an issue with fuel tank. I'm gonna look like the Tin Man before the end of this. And then of course I'll forget that they're loose, start the thing up, and then spray transmission fluid everywhere. Back in the shop today after getting the motor put in the buggy. Pretty sweet, but I'm not really looking forward to what we're working on today. So I have a radiator repair to try today. You can see that little hole right there. This happened from, I didn't have the radiator protected when I was doing some welding in the buggy, and I got a little welding BB in just the wrong spot that was just hot enough to punch a little hole in the core of this radiator. So I'd really like to salvage this radiator because I have a bunch of fabricated parts on here. These mounts and fittings that I welded on. So I'd really like to not have to get a new radiator. So we'll see if we can solder up this radiator for repair. Here I'm just doing a really basic pressure test with the air compressor. I don't really have the right fittings or anything to stick in the AN fittings to test it for real, so I basically just covered up the ports and we'll test it for real once we get some water in it later. Well, it's soldered. We'll see if it holds. I did a basic pressure test. Seems to be holding. We shall see. So it's the end of the day. I didn't get a whole lot more filming, but a bunch of little things done. Got the fuel pump pre-filter installed. Transmission cooler installed, accumulator. Fuel tank partially installed. Radiator installed after the repair. We'll see if it holds. I started running some of the hoses. Fuel pressure regulator and the transmission dipstick. This was almost a disaster. I ended up having to flip this bracket upside down on the fitting to get just a little bit more length that way. When I mocked this up, I think I did the mock-up with this going on the inside of the engine mount, but there's a body panel that goes right here and it wasn't going to fit in there. So going over this way, it was too long, or it was too far away and it wouldn't reach. But I was looking at it for a minute and I thought, well, if I just flip that bracket over on the fitting, it might give me just enough. So I totally lucked out on that. Got a bunch of little things done yesterday. You can see I started routing the hoses. We got a bunch of stuff in the back mounted here. Got the radiator mounted. Fuel tank's just sitting in there right now. But what we're going to be messing with today, I have a little bit of an issue with the fuel tank. The fuel tank's just sitting in here. There's a sheet metal shell, and then this is a bladder. The mount here is spreading the sheet metal just a little bit. And when I mounted this up, there's bracket bars that go here that space out for a basket, storage basket that goes up here. And when I initially mounted this, I didn't have these bolts on the mount super tight, so it fit in there, but now that they're super tight, it's spreading the sheet metal just enough that these holes we're gonna have a problem getting the holes to line up. So we'll be messing with that today. Got a couple ideas on how to resolve that. I'm going to see how far off they are just by putting the brackets up there and seeing how hard or not the bolts are to mount. And if nothing else, we'll see if we can get some washers, some spacers in between the mount and the sheet metal shell to space that out, the shell just enough so that the holes on the top will line up, but we'll see. Okay, we got that installed. Turned out to be not as big of a deal as I thought. So the bolts are just in there holding it for now. The basket will go, those are basically spacers for a storage basket that kind of goes on top. I'll show you that a little bit later. I'm not going to install that right now because I got to get the hoses and everything plumbed, but that makes me feel better. That wasn't as big of a deal. Ended up with the fuel tank just sitting on there, it looked like it was way out, but just a little bit of coercing with a drift, and there's enough flex and bend in that we were able to get them lined up. All right, that's the fuel system plumbed. It's feed, return, and vent. The vent line goes all around the gas tank. I gotta zip tie that up, button that up nice a little bit later. The reason for running the hose all over like that is so whatever orientation you end up in, if you end up rolling over, less likely that you'll spill fuel out. So those hoses go, the feed and the return come up the driver's side there, and then they come up to the fuel pressure regulator, which is kind of buried in there, right there. Back on it today. It's kind of a cold one today, as you can tell. Yesterday we got the fuel system plumbed, and with the fuel system plumbed, think I'll just continue on some of the other plumbing today. So fuel system's in there, the cooling system is in there too, the cooling plumbing. So there's two things left for plumbing. One is the transcooler lines. I think I'll probably tackle that first thing today. And then the other one is going to be the accumulator, which is one hose that goes to the driver's side of the engine. So I might get that going. And then after that, I don't know if we'll get to this today, but possibly start on some of the wiring. I'll probably put the alternator in, so that's positioned, and then go from there. We'll see how far we can get today. Aluminum threads, I always put anti-seize. So, I'm gonna look like the Tin Man before the end of this. Stuff gets everywhere. These AN fittings want to cross thread really easy, so you got to be careful. So that's that side. Fairly clean routing there. Obviously I'm going to tidy all this up. These little bracket looking things here are for zip ties. So that'll all zip tie up, but I gotta get the shifter and everything else in there first. So just waiting on the final button up there. See? Tin Man. Can't help it. Can't figure it out. The stuff gets everywhere, no matter how hard you try. There's the part where you need 3 hands. Oop, stuck. tightened up that end, but I'll probably leave the transmission side loose for now because I may need to move those around or reroute them for other stuff that's going to go over there. And then of course I'll forget that they're loose, start the thing up, and then spray transmission fluid everywhere. So that's how that goes. All right, so we got that plumbing done. Let's see if we can get this alternator installed. You can see it's the alternator, tensioner, pulley kind of bracket, all in one bracket housing. And it goes in the upper passenger head accessory location. So I'll get that installed next, kind of preparing for the wiring. I'll have to wrestle that big heavy thing in there. All right, there we have it installed. Last step is to use this stuff. Put a little bit of this on the bolts. This is called Viz Torque, basically marking compound so you can see if the bolts are coming loose. Next, we'll start putting some of the wiring back together. This is one of the panels in the passenger compartment. So you can see that massive wiring goes on that panel. So there we are, installed and mostly tidied up. Obviously all those pigtails go to stuff in the chassis, and then there's this wiring harness that goes to stuff once it's in the chassis. Once I get it installed, I'll show you where all the rest of that stuff goes. But here's the front of it, without the fuse covers on, obviously. This goes in the kind of the center area in the passenger side foot area. And then this is a plug for a switch panel for the main switch controls for all the accessories. All right, I think that's going to do it for today. Got the transcooler lines installed, got the alternator in, and we got started on the wiring. Everyone's favorite thing, wiring. Next steps are going to be just a little bit more to button up on the plumbing, the accumulator line, and then just plug away at the wiring. Follow along.